Today I'm sewing and sharing another beautiful dress for you to add to your summer wardrobe. This is the Lori dress by Tiana's Closet. It's another one of her beautiful free patterns. I've left a link for you below so you can check out all the details, grab a copy, and sew it along with me. The fabric that I've chosen today is a light and delicate sheer woven. I've chosen to sew this dress omitting the elastic that's recommended in the pattern. The added ease that I now have at the waistline adds to the flowy, carefree attitude of the dress. I hope you sew this along with me. Grab yourself a copy, cut out your fabric, mark your notches, and let's get started. We're going to start by gathering the top of our lower tier piece. Starting at your top corner, use the longest stitch on your machine with about a 3/8 inch seam allowance and sew all the way from one top corner to the other. Make sure you leave thread tails on either end so that you have threads to pull for gathering. Now place the top of your lower tier right sides together with the bottom of your upper tier, matching your centers and pin in place. Also pin them together at the corner, and then we can start pulling our gathering stitches so that the length of the lower tier matches the length of the upper tier from clip to clip. Once the gathers are distributed evenly, go ahead and pin in place. And then you can clip the other corners together. Gather your lower tier in the same way and pin this section. Once you have that pinned in place, take it to your sewing machine and sew all the way across with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then serge the seam to finish. Repeat these steps to attach your other lower tier to your other upper tier. Now that we have the lower tier attached to the upper tier, we're going to gather the top of the upper tier in the same way as we gathered the top of the lower tier, using the longest stitch on your machine all the way across and leaving thread tails on both ends to gather. Grab your front bodice piece and place the gathered edge of your upper tier right sides together with the bodice, matching the centers and pin in place. We're going to gather the upper tier to fit the length of the bottom of the bodice in the same way as we did to attach the lower and upper tiers. Gather and pin all the way across. Now you can sew your front bodice to your upper skirt with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and then serge your seams to finish. Repeat these steps to attach your back bodice to your other skirt. Now place your front and back dress pieces right sides together and pin your side seam matching all of your horizontal seams. And repeat for your other side seam. Sew both of your side seams with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and serge your seams to finish. Also align your front and back shoulder seams right sides together and pin in place, and sew them both with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and serge to finish as well. Now we're going to start working on the binding for the armholes and the neckline. For the binding in these areas, you can use store-bought bias tape. I've cut my own bias tape from the main material, just cutting strips of material at a 45-degree angle, 1¼ inch wide. Now I'm going to take this strip of bias tape to my ironing board and press one of the short edges to the wrong side by about 3/8 of an inch. And with that short edge still pressed under, I'm going to fold it in half the long way and then press that all the way across. Now that that's nice and pressed, we're going to take the side of the bias tape where I press the short edge to the inside. Starting with my neckline, I'm going to match up the raw edges, start clipping on the neckline on the back bodice just under the shoulder seam. I'm going to continue clipping along the V of the back neckline just until I reach the bottom of the V. Now with my bias tape extending beyond that V, I'm going to take a ruler and a marking tool and draw a line straight down vertically extending from the bottom of my V. Drawing that straight line from the bottom of your V onto your bias tape will help you know where to stop your stitching as you stitch from the top of your shoulder tape to the bottom of the V. I'm going to stitch this bias tape through all layers with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Stop at that line where the seam allowance intersects the line. And I'm also going to back stitch at that point to secure. So now I have half of my back bodice neckline binding stitched in place and secured at the bottom of the V. Before I continue binding the other side of the V, I need to create an angle here in the stitching so that when I flip the bias binding to the inside, it maintains this nice V shape here. I'm going to fold my back bodice piece wrong sides together And then I'm going to take the tail of my binding, fold it to the other side so that it lays nicely on the other side of that V. Doing that allows us to see this bias tape that extends beyond the center of the back bodice. I'm going to place a pin here through all layers, and I'm going to sew my bias tape from my stitching line to the bottom V formed on my bias tape. Careful as I sew just to sew the bias tape and not the dress. We're just sewing to form a triangle here, right along the edge of that center of the back bodice. Now I'm going to trim away the excess fabric on that bias tape beyond the stitching that I just sewed, leaving about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance there. Now I have a nice angle in my binding that will allow me to cleanly finish the rest of the neckline. Start pinning now on the other side of that V and continue all the way around to where your binding began. And when you get back to where you started your binding, allow this loose end to overlap and pin in place. Allow it to overlap by about 1/2 inch and snip off what you don't need. I'm going to continue sewing my binding to the rest of the neckline with the 1/4 inch seam allowance, starting by placing my needle right where my stitching stopped earlier, moving this tiny seam allowance out of the way so that I can cleanly place my needle right in there. Backstitch at this area to secure, and then stitch all the way around. Now I'm going to take a pair of sharp scissors and clip into this V to the stitching line and not beyond. And then we're ready to understitch our neckline binding. We're going to press the outside folded edge of our binding over on itself on top of that seam allowance, and then sew the binding to the seam allowance 1/8 of an inch away from the original stitching line, all the way around. The clipping that you did into the V will give you the ease that you need to open up that fabric to allow you to understitch this area nicely. As you're approaching the V, when you get to about 3/8 of an inch away from that V, you can stop your stitching and backstitch to secure, and then start fresh understitching on the other side of the V, again 3/8 of an inch away from the bottom of the V, backstitch to secure, and continue on your way. So now that our neckline is completely bound and understitched, we're ready to flip it to the inside and give it one last stitch around to complete. Flip that binding to the inside of the garment right along that seam line and pin in place. Now that I have it pinned all the way around, I'm going to take it to my machine and edge stitch all around the binding, all along this bottom edge on the inside of the dress. And when you get to the bottom of your V, simply pivot your stitching and continue on your way. I've prepared my armhole binding in the same way as I did for the neckline binding. I took it to my ironing board and pressed one of the short edges to the wrong side by 3/8 of an inch and pressed the entirety of the long edges in half, again wrong sides together, all the way across. Now I'm going to take that side with the short edge that's tucked under, line it up right sides together with my bodice at the underarm seam, pin in place. Continue pinning the binding to the armhole all the way around. And once you've pinned that all the way around and you're back where you started, allow that loose end to overlap the beginning of your bias tape by about 1/2 inch and cut off the excess beyond that and pin in place. Now we're going to sew this binding to the armhole in the same way as we did for the neckline. Go ahead and sew all the way around with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And now that I have that binding applied to the armhole, I'm going to flip the binding to the inside of the garment, again right along that seam line, pin in place. Continue pinning all the way around. Once it's pinned in place, take it to your sewing machine and edge stitch close to this inner fold all the way around. And repeat all of these steps to finish your other armhole. And the very last step is to hem the bottom of the dress. I'm just going to take this dress to the sewing machine, and as I sew, I'm going to fold up the raw edge to the wrong side by 1/4 of an inch, and then just fold that 1/4 of an inch over on itself to form a rolled hem, and I'm going to edge stitch close to this folded edge all the way around the dress. And now you're all done with your dress. Thank you for watching this sew along. Make sure you check out my other sew alongs for more great sewing inspiration, and I'll see you in the next video. it.